Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to start by thanking all the participants here on site and online. For your information, our event is being broadcast live on YouTube. And finally, I'd like to greet all our distinguished speakers and panelists. We are very honored to have you all here in this special event. I am Hyeon, head of the Power Program at Solutions for Our Climate, a nonprofit organization based in South Korea. This event, Redefining the Energy Sector for a Clean, Secure, and Just Transition for All, is co-hosted by Solutions for Our Climate, Carbon Tracker Initiative, Global Wind Energy Council, and Pembina Institute. We are at a stage realizing that the key to energy transition is understanding how the traditionally fossil fuel reliant power sector can be transformed into accommodating renewables. What kind of power market policy and technical reform should take place to integrate more renewables into the grid? This event will discuss and answer these questions by bringing together global experts from the power sector, civil society, and corporations. Before we get started, we are honored to have the welcome remarks by the Climate Change Ambassador of Canada, Ms. Catherine Stewart. Please welcome her.
Good afternoon, and it is really, really great to be here to speak with you all about the global energy transition, a matter that is becoming more and more pressing every day. But before I begin, I'd like to really thank the organizers for pulling this together, Solutions for Our Climate, the Pembina Institute, Carbon Tracker, and Global Wind Energy Council. Today you'll hear from a very wide variety of experts who are exemplary in redefining the energy transition, with the aim to avoid fossil fuel lock-in and ensure that clean energy transition is a just transition. In Canada, we continue to move forward with our ambitious net zero agenda. We've committed to phase out coal by 2030, reach net zero electricity grid by 2035, and achieve a net zero economy by 2050. To meet those targets, our approach is multifaceted. A big part of this is the shift to renewable power and grid modernization. For example, we launched the Smart Renewables and Electrification Pathways Programming, which provides over $1.5 billion to support large-scale renewable energy projects capable of providing grid services, energy storage, and grid modernization. Alongside renewable deployment, we are also supporting promising emerging technologies that will support a whole of economy transition to net zero, such as CCUS and small modular reactors. In Canada's last budget, the government introduced a refundable investment tax credit valued at $2.6 billion over 5 years to advance the deployment and adoption of CCUS technology. Our support also includes investments in small modular reactors, both in terms of development and demonstration of this emerging technology, as well as regulatory harmonization. So we must keep all options on the table. And in redefining the energy sector, we also have to harness and enhance the progress we are already making. In order to leverage such smart and flexible end uses, the system must, among other things, redefine how consumers interact with the electricity system as a whole and how utilities, system operators, and regulators support such engagement. Canada has taken leadership in advancing these necessary innovations in business models and markets through multiple programs. For example, through our Smart Grid program, we've invested $100 million over 5 years in 21 projects across Canada to develop necessary smart grid capabilities, including market design. Of course, we can't talk about energy transition without talking about the phase out of coal, and Canada leads the Powering Past Coal Alliance with the UK. And together with our members and stakeholders, we've been making considerable progress over the last 5 years since its inception. It's the world's leading initiative driving global ambition to retire coal power and deploy solutions to advance the clean energy transition. Since its launch in 2017, over 165 national governments, subnational governments, and organizations have joined the alliance. Canada's energy transition and coal phase-out is also a cornerstone of our $5.3 billion climate finance commitment. Last year, at COP26, we announced a significant contribution of $1 billion to climate investment funds, Accelerating Coal Transition Investment Program, which is now supporting coal transition in South Africa, Indonesia, Philippines, and India. We know that the scale of investment required is significant. Public finance cannot do it alone, but we must lead the way. Targeted support will also be necessary, such as private finance mobilization, which is why Canada is supporting OECD's Clean Energy Finance and Investment Mechanism to help countries attract more private investment in clean energy. Policy support, data and analysis, why we are supporting the IEA Clean Energy Transitions Program, and deeper engagement with country partners and key stakeholders in coal regions, which is why Canada is a proud supporter of the Southeast Asia Transition Partnership through a $5 million contribution announced last week to support this in Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines. So the transition to clean energy is really just all underway, and with this collaboration, partnerships, and the will of people in this room, we know we can make the progress we need. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Now, we will welcome a keynote speech from Mr. John Murton. Please come to the, stage? Okay.
Thank you very much. I don't know if all of you have been at COP for 8 days already. If you have, then the prospect of a keynote speech probably fills you with some dread. So I will try and keep my remarks sort of interesting and slightly provocative, and in so doing I might take my government hat off and just put it down there at the side for a minute. I can put it back on if you want me to, but I suspect it'll be a more interesting discussion. Obviously we are 2/3 of the way through COP than if I speak very dryly. I wanted to give some remarks just to situate the debate about energy transition and hopefully give us a bit of framing that colleagues can then pick up and use. Many of you will remember the words of our former Prime Minister, and I know we're going through them a little bit of late, but our former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, ahead of COP26, who referred very effectively to cash, coal, cars and trees, which were the 4 campaigns that we launched ahead of COP26. And coal fits, covers off very clearly the energy transition discussion that we're speaking about. It's not just coal, but coal is at the heart of what we're talking about when it comes to energy transitions, because we know it's the most polluting of the fossil fuels, and we really need to take swift action on coal in this decade if we're to achieve our climate goals. But what Prime Minister Johnson did so well when he split it into monikers like cash, coal, cars, trees, is he communicated it very effectively. I've been working as the UK's COP26 envoy for 3 years now, in preparation of our presidency and then through the year of our presidency. And a lot of my time has involved traveling actually and virtually around the world, trying to persuade countries to make progress on the campaign commitments that we were pushing ahead of COP26. And what I found very strongly was that the narrative that I was so used to hearing in the United Kingdom about why we needed to tackle coal and reduce coal and we've got to save the polar bears and melting ice sheets and so on was great. And it's a really good narrative and it really works in its place. But go far outside northwestern Europe and sometimes you find that that narrative doesn't have so much of a traction, or whilst it works in some parts of a society, it doesn't work in others. So what I found was really important in my time in this role, in terms of trying to advance a transition in the energy sector, was to develop a compelling narrative that spoke to economic issues that policymakers around the world are concerned about, because we all know that the supply of clean, cheap, affordable, predictable energy is really important if you're a rapidly industrializing nation in Southeast Asia. It's really important if you're a policymaker in South Africa trying to keep the lights on as Eskom has load shedding. And it's a really important discussion if you're a policymaker in Japan or Korea trying to think out how do we maintain our industrial competitiveness. And where I've really benefited in my role as envoy over the last 3 years is when I compare to my Danish colleague a decade ago. A decade ago, we were always asking countries to reduce their emissions and trade away a little bit of economic growth in order to deliver on our climate goals. And the huge changes we've seen over the last decade in the cost of renewables and the cost of battery technology and the cost of zero-emission vehicle technology means that I'm now able to go and say with a really straight face to a policymaker in Tokyo, in the Ministry for Economy, Trade and Industry, or in Seoul at MOTI, and say, look, actually, if you want to grow your economy, you're going to need to green it, because you're paying 13, 14 cents a kilowatt hour for your power in Japan or in Korea. India's putting on 500 gigawatts of solar, and they're doing the latest deals at 2.5 cents a kilowatt hour. How are your energy-intensive industries going to compete with the energy-intensive industries in India or in Indonesia or in other places in the world that are investing very heavily in renewables that are now the cheapest form of electricity known to man? And that's a really powerful narrative. And it's one that I'm hearing over the 3 years I've done this job, and we've been putting it out there for 3 years. It's one that I'm now increasingly hearing, and my colleagues are hearing from their colleagues around the world. And one major emerging economy that we've been working with very closely, the energy minister said to us just 18 months ago, they said, we've probably built our last coal-fired power station because we can't find private sector finance to build another coal-fired power station. And within 3 or 4 years, the marginal cost of operating an existing coal power station that you might inherit from your rich uncle is going to be more than the cost of investing and financing in new solar. So really seeing for themselves that the market economics have shifted very powerfully. And the comparison I make, which is hackneyed and probably familiar to you all, is these. When I was at university, and I'm betraying my age, no one had a mobile phone. And if you made a plan, you stuck to it. And I tell my teenage daughter this, and she doesn't really thank me for it. And you can't just cancel by sending a text message. But suddenly, phones then became more popular, and then all of a sudden, everybody had a phone. And I was the sort of last person in my friendship group not to have a phone. And suddenly, you go very quickly from being it's something that's too expensive you can't afford to something that you can't afford not to have. And I think we're rapidly seeing that transition with the renewable economy as people realize that that's where the economics of growth are. And we're seeing this increasingly also, and we're working to accelerate that process through mechanisms like the Clean Energy Transition Partnership that we launched at COP26, where 35 countries committed to end all their international support for fossil fuels, with a few exceptions. And that meant that up to $28 billion a year of government finance internationally was switching from fossil fuels to the renewable sector, lowering the cost of capital for those renewable projects and making them even more competitive than they had been before. We've been working very closely over the last year in the context of the Just Energy Transition Partnership. So many of you will have seen the Just Energy Transition Partnership declaration we launched with South Africa last year at COP26, where partners like the UK, the EU, France, Germany, and the US mobilized $8.5 billion of public finance to support the transition of South Africa from one of the world's most carbon-intensive energy systems to a low-carbon economy. And what we've been doing over the last year is working out with the South Africans, how are we going to invest that money? And the discussion began looking at whether we should use that concessional financing to support generation, or whether we should use it to support the delivery of retraining for miners who would be affected by the transition. And it rapidly became clear through the course of the year with our discussions with our South African colleagues, and you've seen this in the launch last week by President Ramaphosa of the $97 billion investment plan for South Africa, that it made much more sense to work on reforming the South African electricity market and stripping out some of the barriers that were preventing private sector companies investing, so that you could actually fund your new wind or solar and so on through private sector investment, and conserving that concessionary capital for dealing with the obstacles to a just transition in South Africa, what was necessary to implement a just transition in South Africa to support the retraining of affected mine workers and so on. Because what they've found in South Africa is actually the transition to low carbon generation makes perfect economic sense, but you've got a really considerable political set of issues to manage in terms of supporting that transition, because the transition will happen, but there are going to be communities that are affected and that we need to support through that transition if you're to gain that political license to make it happen. So I will end there, but hopefully we've sort of set up a couple of issues that the panel can discuss. And in particular, one of the things that I think is important to discuss is how do we describe the opportunities that flow from a grid that has more variable generation than was previously the case? Because when I speak to some policymakers around the world, that's a fear for them. It's a risk. What happens if there's not enough electricity? What happens if the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, and what happens then? And what we need to do is increasingly find a narrative where we can describe that as an opportunity for the generation of a whole new bunch of technologies that can be developed and exported around the world, and that we can all sort of drive our prosperity with and achieve the clean, cheap, affordable power that is so necessary, not just for our economic growth, but also for tackling our climate goals. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your experience as the UK COP26 envoy, Mr. John Murton. We will now move on to the speaker's discussion. We will provide each speaker 5 minutes to give us a brief introduction of the organization that you represent and what kind of steps you are taking to expand more renewables and make grid more flexible. So I will begin with Antonella Battaglini, the CEO of Renewable Grid Initiatives. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. So Renewables Grid Initiative, RGI in short, is an association of transmission system operators, environmental and climate NGOs from across Europe. I tend to say that this is a unique animal in town because there is not such an organization like us. And we have been around for over 12 years, so we are getting out of infancies. We have realized very early on that the electricity grid is one fundamental piece of the energy transition. The environmental and climate community have been advocating for many years, I would say almost 2 decades, for an economy that is based essentially exclusively on renewable energy sources. But they were very late at realizing that it's not possible to have renewables without having an electricity grid. So we are looking at developing very practical alliances between these two diverse interest groups to find the solutions that prove that it is indeed possible to integrate very large amount of mainly solar and wind in a reliable, economical, and safe way. And here I would like to stress the fact that today it is, there are a lot of options on the table, but very often they are looked at with a narrow perspective. If we want to achieve full decarbonization, largely with renewable energy sources, then we need to have a system approach. And I would like to insist on the fact that having wind and solar at the base of an electricity system, it is possible. In Europe, we are actually doing that. Europe has plans to have until 2030, 45% of total energy based on renewable. This means that we will have 100% renewable energy electricity system. And today we already have countries that operate the grid with 100% renewables for weeks and days without any problem. The way to look at it is that you need to build up the flexibility that allow to compensate with this variability. So all the countries where the grid is not strong enough, you will need to reinforce it and expand it. Very often, this is perceived to be too large of an investment, but the reality, grid costs are a fraction of generation cost. So whenever you have an option, you always have to compare with alternatives. And finally, I would like to mention that we have no longer the luxury of abundance. We live in a world of scarcity where time, resources, space, it's becoming more and more scarce. And therefore, we need to look at the energy system to optimize it from the generation to the demand side. There is a huge potential in energy saving by simply removing combustion processes. And by doing this, you reduce not only the primary energy demand, but also you reduce the need for resources. Finally, I think we are at the COP because we want to speed up this energy transition. And very often we have actors that are very strongly interested to keep the status quo or keep promoting the solutions of last millennium. But economic growth in the future will be largely based on national resources. And national resources are everywhere in the world, solar and wind, you'll find there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Antonella, for giving us a good overview of your European experience and what our priority should be to increase renewables. Next, we will have Eoghan Griffin, the head of sustainability for the EMEA region at Meta. Please go ahead.
Super. Good pronunciation of my first name. Hi, everyone. We're delighted to be here today, so thank you to the organisers for extending an invite. My name is Eoghan Griffin. I am the head of sustainability for EMEA at Meta, responsible for our external engagement and our policy work. And really, I'm here in my capacity today to represent our incredible energy team who have been so key to Meta's really strong track record in this space. So at our organisation, Supporting and sourcing renewable energy has been absolutely key in our company's decarbonisation efforts over the course of the past decade. Really, since we started building our first data centres back in 2013 in the United States, and as we've expanded our data centres and our footprint in EMEA, in countries like Denmark, Sweden and Ireland, we have been sourcing renewable energy, and to date we are at about 8 megawatts of renewable energy procured over the course of those years. So in that regard, sourcing renewable energy has been one of our strong points as a company, and at various points we have been the #1 buyer of renewable energy globally. Some of our peers have sadly taken over us now as they've grown bigger, but that's a record that we're incredibly proud of. Going forward, we were delighted in 2020 to celebrate achieving 100% renewable energy for our operations and our data centers and our offices. That's allowed us to achieve net zero emissions for scopes 1 and 2, but we've set an ambitious target to be net zero emissions for scope 3, so for our full value chain. And to achieve that, we know that we're going to have to work with suppliers across the world and globally, and in particularly in Asia, where we source a lot of our products and make our headsets and our portal products. We know that supporting our suppliers and our supply chain in some countries which have are less advanced in their renewable energy progress is going to be key as well. So really, although we've achieved 100% renewable energy for our own direct operations, we know that expanding our energy program, our renewable energy program globally, is going to continue to be a strong focus of ours until 2030. And this week at COP, or last week at COP more specifically, we were proud to be one of the founding members of the Asia Clean Energy Coalition, really signaling our intent to participate more in the renewable energy market in Asia to support our expanding operations globally. And I think there's a lot of question about the role of public-private partnership at COP and the kind of collaborations that happen. And I think it's that initiative, the ASEC initiative, which is really the best example of where corporate players in the private sector can partner with the industry more broadly to push decarbonisation in some of those key areas. So again, just to reiterate, we're excited to be here and be participating in this conversation and kind of participating in COP more broadly to cement and show our how seriously I think we're taking the fight against climate change. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. So he shared like good efforts to decarbonizing your supply chain to even Asian contributed an example of the good coalition. Thank you. So next, we will have Ms. Mika Ohbayashi from Renewable Energy Institute. She's a director. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for the introduction. My name is Mika Ohbayashi at the Renewable Energy Institute. Our institute was founded in 2011, just after the nuclear accident of Fukushima. And then we are focusing on the renewable energy policy research mainly. And the result will be used for the advocate, the stakeholders, policy makers to adopt the advanced renewable energy policies in Japan. And then so we started from the research institute, but we have the strong relation with stakeholders and then engagement in the business as well. Actually, that we have established a business alliance to take more friendly climate actions. How can I say, above the Japanese government. And then we started 4 years ago with 150 business entities such as Sony, Hitachi, SoftBank. But now it counted the 700 organizations join our network. And then they have the higher target of the renewables and then greenhouse gas emissions deepens than the government target. The next slide, please. So Japan is quite rich in the natural resources, the renewables, but actually the renewable energy prices in Japan are still very expensive. I think that I can do without slides. If it doesn't work, it's fine. So to the maximize the renewable energies that in the country that we need the cheap renewables at the very large scale in the grid system. But actually that, as you can see, partially, Japan's renewables is still high, and then the cheapest energy source in Japan is the coal-fired power plant. And so the Japanese government target for renewables compared to other countries in the next slide, that are rather higher. You can see that we have the 34 to 38% by 2030, but besides the other European countries and the US has the more larger renewable or non-fossil fuel target in the electricity sector. I think that it's a kind of a half or the 1/3 of other countries of target. And the next slide and the next slide, please. Skip this slide. And then you could see the development of renewables in Japan is very slow. We started from 10% in 2000, but actually that at that time, that if I compare with other countries such as UK and Germany, they are less than 5%. But in just 20 years, they increased the portion of renewables in the electricity mix like a 45%. But we could increase the renewables started from 2012 when we introduced the German type of feed-in tariff in the country. And then we could increase that mainly the solar power PV in our system, because solar power doesn't have the kind of constraints in the grid system and the land constraints compared to the wind power. So now that in Japan that we have the 74 gigawatt of solar PV in the country, so Japan is the third country in the world to install that solar PV. But compared to that, the wind is quite minimum. Only 4.5 gigawatt is installed in the country. So as a result that you can see, the fossil fuel sufficiency is quite low in Japan, but still the Japanese government has a target to continue to use a fossil fuel. The next slide, please. So by 2050, that you can see the renewable energy target, of course, that will be increased from the 38%, but still 50 to 60%. But at this point, that the 2050, we have to reach the carbon neutrality, but still that we continue to use a fossil fuel by 2050. That is the current government policy. So we have to change this. And then, so can you go to the last slide, please? Skip this slide, skip this slide, and skip this slide. And this is the current situation of the price of the fossil fuel, that you could see that the coal per kilowatt hour is now the 16.4 yen. So it's about the 15 cents US dollars that you can say. And it used to be, only 2 years ago, it was 2 cents per kilowatt hour, but now 16.4 cents. And the LNG, it was 4.1 cents, but now 22.5 yen, so it's about the 20 cents per kilowatt hour. So even the renewable energy cost is higher in Japan compared to other countries. Those kind of a very high price of coal and LNG make the renewable really competitive in the power market. So we have to take the opportunity to maximize renewables electricity in the electricity grid. And then skip the slide, and then next slide, please. And then that is a little bit difficult to see, but I put Japan on the map of the Europe. Japan is divided into 10 parts in terms of the power supply. So we have the 10 big incumbent utilities to supply electricity, and then in each area that principally they have to control the demand and supply by themselves. So Japan is a big island, has a huge energy demand, but actually it was divided in 10 area. So the power supply and demand area was really minimized. And then so we need a kind of a strong grid system inside of our country. We need a flexibility between those different power supply areas. And then if we put it in the Europe, that we could say, like western side of Japan is equivalent for the France, and then eastern part of Japan is equivalent as the Germany. Or maybe that with the small countries that we can say, Japan is equal, like Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Belgium, Germany in one country. So we can provide a huge flexibility for get the integration of the variable renewables in the country if we are really integrated well. So, and then, as already mentioned, like, those kind of flexibility and then good grid system make the renewable cost really cheaper. And then that we could have the abundant amount of renewables at a very large scale with a cheap price in our country if we could have the flexibility in our grid system. And then I think that it is possible that in Japan too.
Thank you for sharing the Japanese perspectives. I see a lot of similarities between the Japanese market and Koreans, because under this like regionally monopolized market in Japan, for example, we are also having like similar, very similar phenomenon that we are seeing a very high price of renewable with the lack of flexibilities. I think I'd like to have questions around, but due to the time constraint, just let me move over first, and then if time allows, then I will get back to the question. So next, we'll have Mr. David Wright, the Group Chief Engineer at National Grid. Please go ahead.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here. And I'm going to pick up John Martin's keynote challenge of hopefully trying to tell you or explain how I think we can achieve that goal that you set us. National Grid owns and operates gas and electricity networks in two of the most developed nations in the world, in the UK and in the US. Today, we've put 37 gigawatts of renewables onto the UK grid on a 55 gigawatt power system. So you can see the level of progress that we've already made. Last year, over 53% of the UK's electricity was generated from zero carbon sources. We've already operated the grid on one particular day at 93% zero carbon. And our target is to get to 100% for those first few hours and days in 2025, and then a fully decarbonized the UK electricity grid by 2035. In the US, in Massachusetts and New York, where we operate, we're on that same pathway, exactly the same pathway. We think we'll get there by 2040 based on current trajectories and plans. So how do you do this? How do you deliver a renewables-based zero-carbon electricity grid and do it stably? So that's the key question I wanted to answer. Well, the first thing I wanted to say is, you know, if we are building a new power station today, you need to build it from wind or solar. You can do it on the size. You can get exactly the same size, if not even more size today, given where the technology is, and it will be cheaper. It is cheaper today to build a renewables power station than it is a fossil fuel power station. So why wouldn't you want to do it? So to do it and deliver that power network stable 365 days a year, there's sort of a few things that you also need to do. You need to invest in flexibility. And when I'm talking about flexibility, I'm not just talking about demand-side response and some of those. They're all needed, don't get me wrong. But fundamentally, our vision of flexibility is no longer dispatching the generation to meet the demand, but dispatching the demand to meet the available green electrons when the green electrons are available. Now, to do that, you do need to invest in smart meters, you do need to invest in EVs, batteries, heat pumps, but you also need to change your market and reform your market and fundamentally have a market which doesn't set the price of electricity as it is today in the UK based on the price of the fossil fuel generator that's setting the marginal rate, but actually have a wholesale electricity market which is based on the price of flexibility on a half-hour by half-hour basis. And I think if you change the market, the technology and the solutions are there. Great companies like Meta and others providing the automation and the control systems in order to be able to make that happen. So the first thing is go all in on flexibility. The second thing you need to do is invest in long duration storage. And by long duration, I'm talking hundreds of hours. So that when the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining, you've got alternative sources of zero carbon generation. By 2035, when we're 100% carbon free in the UK, we estimate we'll need 35 terawatt hours of long duration storage. That is a huge number, and it's probably the remaining biggest technical challenge. However, let me give you one example of how to do this. A few years ago, we built and we commissioned just over 18 months ago, a new 1.4 gigawatt interconnector to Norway. Last year, that interconnector delivered 4.6 terawatt hours of zero carbon generation into the UK. The UK sent back to Norway 1.6 terawatt hours. So it's a mutual investment. Now, not all of your storage, long duration storage can be delivered by interconnectors, but it's one example of how technology is there today available for you to be able to use alternative sources that geographically might be around your individual countries. We also need hydrogen. There's no other, credible technology that I think can effectively deliver the level of storage we need. Hopefully they'll materialize, but we absolutely need a hydrogen economy as well. And then the third thing you need for this stable grid of the future is, investing in technology. We have already now piloted restarting the power system, black starting the grid, if you will. If the grid was completely shut down, we've piloted and proved that you can now do that from an onshore wind farm. The technology, the power system engineering is there now to be able to do that. We now need to deliver that at scale together with other ancillary services, and those are all being progressed through the UK market at the moment and equally in the US market. The final thing we all need to do is around recognizing that it's not only about mitigation, it is also about adaptation and equality. Fairness is absolutely key to this. I've been talking to climate scientists this week, as you'd probably expect from an engineer. But the IPCC climate scientists I've been talking to are saying it is very likely we will exceed 2 degrees of warming in our land base around the world by 2050. And for prudency, David, you should really plan for 2.7 degrees. And one of the reasons for that is land will warm more than the seas and the oceans. And particularly urban populations in cities are the most exposed. So we need to deliver the mitigation investments, deliver that renewable grid of the system, but also invest in our existing systems, our existing millions of assets in our networks. And that needs a systematic approach. So GRID's approach is effectively to take the latest climate science data, and then we've developed a model which looks at 9 physical climate events: temperature change, sea level rise, river, pluvial flooding, storm, wind speeds. And then effectively we've mapped geospatially all of our assets on our network. And then we can look at different scenarios, 2, 3, 4 degree scenarios, to understand where the vulnerabilities on our network will be, and then how do we start planning today to make sure that we've addressed those and we've got a resilient network for when we'll need it in the future as the climate warms. So that systematic approach is really needed. So today, I absolutely believe the technology is there to deliver a clean, fair, stable, and affordable 100% renewables-based electricity grid. There is no reason for any of us not to be going all in on this. It does need money, it does need investment. National Grid alone is going to be investing 40 billion over the next 5 years. It needs leadership, it needs commitment. But the opportunity is there for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing the importance of the flexibilities and the grid and technologies. And yes, I'll definitely have the question coming back to you later on. So now we are moving on to Dr. Hyeon Park, Executive Vice President for the Environmental Planning Office at POSCO.
Hello, everyone. It is a great honor for me to give my comments from the view of steel industry at this very important side event of energy transition. As you know, iron and steelmaking industry has made its role for the modern society related to diverse industries, including automobile, construction, and shipbuilding. The steel industry, meanwhile, has faced its big challenge to sustain its business. As all of we know, it is mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions. The amount of greenhouse gas emissions from the steel industry is approximately 7% of total in the world. So many of the steelmaking companies, including POSCO, have deeply recognized the matter and accelerating their efforts to mitigate the emissions. One of our ambitious projects is hydrogen steelmaking, which can replace current coal-based blast furnace process into hydrogen-based one. The coal is used to remove oxygen from iron ore of oxide form and thus convert it into silver-colored steel. Since coal is the reducing agent rather than just fuel, there is only one option of a material which can replace the coal, and that is hydrogen. No hydrogen steelmaking process of a commercial scale is available so far, so we have to develop a new process. POSCO began the project already. We named the project as a HYDEX, hydrogen-based iron ore reduction process. And we have to overcome 2 big mountains to commercialize this HYDEX technology. Well, first one is definitely success of a technology development. So hydrogen is a so light gas, it is more than 14 times lighter than hot air. Well, now hot air is injected into the center of a conventional blast furnace, but we cannot inject hydrogen gas into the center of a large diameter because it is too light. It looks like that I cannot hit a ping pong ball with a golf driver to more than 200 yards. So POSCO HYDEX has been designed based on FINEX technology, which is equipped with a proper fluidized bed reactor to treat the light hydrogen gas. A demo plan of a HYDEX plant will be built by 2028. Its annual capacity of hot metal production will be approximately 1 million tons per year, which is exactly the same size of a commercialized first blast furnace in Korean history. Discussions with the global steelmakers are going on also to enhance the cooperation of the project. The demo plant, meanwhile, will consume approximately 90,000 tons of hydrogen to produce 1 million tons of hot metal. This means that we need at least 900,000 tons of hydrogen to operate an integrated iron and steel mills over 10 million tons capacity. In addition, green electricity should be supplied, probably from national grid, for melting and rolling process. Our second mountain is how we can secure this large volume of hydrogen supply. Well, of course, we can simply talk the waste from renewable energy. Since it is very much depending on local, regional, and national conditions, we need to consider a variety of transition paths as well, including hydrogen transportation as a form of ammonia, or natural gas with a CCS option, and other carbon-free energy source. We have to find out practical solutions to secure the amount of hydrogen supply in big scale and in stable way. Real big challenge is here. Well, yes, I believe that we can make it on someday in future, but to shorten the journey to the carbon net zero, we need a cooperation between private sectors and government. This cooperation can be made when the roles of both sides are done, where steel industry should develop the breakthrough technologies, while government should lead to build countrywide hydrogen infrastructure and its policy. The role of steel has been grown to renewable energy and is a related business. Advanced steel is to build wind power towers, solar power frames, and battery pack materials, and fuel cell separation parts, since it is stronger, lighter, and better corrosion resistant than conventional ones.
Sorry to interrupt, Dr.
I'm just summarizing.
We appreciate.
Simply a better product to cut the greenhouse gas emissions through the value chain. That is another important mission of steel business sectors for carbon net zero society. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for sharing your industrial perspectives. And since we are running out of our time, we will be quickly moving on to the next speaker. So, Mr. Ahmed Mulla, the Deputy CEO of Infinity, please go ahead.
Thank you. Cognizant of time, I'll be brief. So, I come from a very different perspective than my colleagues here, in the sense that Infinity Power is dedicated to the production of renewable energy solutions and specifically applied to the African continent. In the coming quarter, Q1 of 2023, Infinity Power is looking forward to becoming the largest renewable energy producer from operational projects in Africa. Recently, along with our partners, we've signed a memorandum of understanding with the Egyptian government for the production of 10,000 megawatts from wind. We are also working on green hydrogen and green ammonia projects that will also be announced during COP27. We're very proactive in this space. When we talk about an energy transition, a just and fair energy transition for all, I think Africa as a continent is one of those where we need to apply a definition for that. What is just and what is fair when we talk about an energy transition where a continent over 60% of its population lack electricity access? The solutions are there. We've heard that we can apply renewable energy. We need policymakers, we need financing. Now, as a renewable energy developer, it is frustrating for us to find obstacles on the ground. We have the solutions, they're economically viable. There's thought leadership that is lacking sometimes. There's a lot of misinformation that we need to overcome with regards to intermittency, with regards to how much renewable energy can be connected into the grid without it becoming destabilized. We know from the examples from Germany and other European countries that you can have an integration of an energy mix with a large penetration of renewables of over 60% without destabilizing the network. So the situation in Africa is multifaceted, and I can probably talk for hours on every aspect of the challenges and obstacles, but I think it starts with policy and regulation. If you have bankable policies that invite and secure investments from international developers, then that sets a fertile ground for the deployment of renewable power. The other aspect is the existence of an electricity grid that is interconnected for the African continent to provide access to those remote areas where people do not have access to the electricity grid, as well as an interconnection between countries. When you have distributed renewable energy power from different countries using different technologies, whether it's wind, solar, waste to energy, hydro, with the integration of battery storage and green hydrogen, you can then cover the gaps when there is intermittency in certain countries or certain geographies. Then an integrated network, cross-boundary trading, can allow that transition to occur. We know that the prices are affordable. They are more affordable than conventional generation. In certain African countries who are dependent on diesel, the prices are extortionately high, and they are in desperate need for this renewable energy transition, where they have all the resources available in their countries, and what they lack is commitment from the international financing and development community to deploy the finance and technology needed to satisfy the demand. There's potential for growth, there's potential in Africa for prosperity, and energy is a key to unlocking this. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a good overview of the African renewable market as well. I'd like to have a Q&A session for this, but yeah, due to the limited time, we need to move on to the next panel discussion. So please give them a big applause. Okay. So I will introduce our moderator today for the panel discussion. Please, Ms. Young Losno from Regulatory Assistance Projects. And
Okay, let's start with the last part of this meeting. I'm Jan Rosenau, and I work for an organization called RAP, the Regulatory Assistance Project. It's my first day at COP, and I'm already absolutely tired. I don't know how you feel, but it's just exhausting, isn't it? At least we don't have the background noise in this room, so that helps. We have a quick round of questions for the panelists, and then hopefully we have time for Q&A. And actually the last comment that was made is a great introduction, because this session is very much about regulation and policy. And I think the last words that were said on the previous panel were very much that it's policy that has to invite investment and secure it to scale renewables. So my first question is for Binnu Jeyakumar, who works for Pembina Institute in Canada. And you've done a lot of work over the years on trying to scale renewables for better policy, better regulation. You know, what kinds of policies really work in your experience to scale up the renewable energy industry?
Thanks for that question. Thanks, Jan. I think like everyone else on this panel, I could probably speak about this for hours, but we'll try to contain my remarks to a few minutes. In Canada, time and again, we've seen strong policy that sets certainty for industry and provides an imperative for industry to accelerate its action. And often this is aided by a market that allows for prompt action in reaction to appropriate price signals. So I want to give an illustration of policy working with good market design using an unlikely example. So the Canadian province of Alberta, I think, has gained some notoriety at most COPs. For most non-Canadians, it's known as the province of the oil sands. But did you know it is also the province that has the largest growth of renewables in Canada? In particular, between 2019 and 2022, we saw about 2 gigawatts of corporate renewable deals signed in Alberta. So just to give you some perspective, it took the province 15 years to install the 1.5 gigawatts of renewables that they had in 2019. So that is truly a hockey stick curve. Just want to give a quick primer on corporate procurement. So these are deals that are struck by companies such as Meta to purchase environmental attributes from renewable energy producers. And in jurisdictions like Alberta, they're actually able to use these deals to hedge the cost of power to them. From a renewable producer or developer's perspective, this also provides them with revenue certainty. And that actually makes a world of difference in terms of cost of capital for the developer. Now, why are these deals happening in Alberta at this scale? It boils down to a combination of at least 3 factors. One is the declining cost of renewables, and I think I don't need to explain that to the room, except perhaps there are some complex dynamics in Japan worth of exploring. The second is Alberta's deregulated market, and I'm going to get to that in a minute. But the third is the price discovery that happened in Alberta because of a renewable energy program that was launched by the government in 2017. This was a contract for difference procurement program for renewables, like most auctions that you see. And I was actually in the room with a lot of industry colleagues when the results were announced. And I remember distinctly the audible collective gasp when we heard the cost. The final price, the average price, was $28 per megawatt hour. And in Canada, that was unprecedented. That was about half the cost of other auctions that had happened in Canada to that date. So it was a game changer. And so this auction, coming at the heels of another commitment by the government to have 30% renewables by 2030, actually really sent a strong signal to companies outside of Canada even that Alberta is a good place to invest. Now on market design, there were, I'd say, 3 features of the Alberta's deregulated market that attracts corporate PPAs. So Alberta's market is similar to Texas. Alberta doesn't get as much news for its electricity market as Texas does, but we're kind of similar, like we're completely deregulated. But there are sort of 3 elements that are important. One is that our market allows for independent power producers to install new generation without going through a central procurement process or central planning. And so producers can actually respond quickly to changing economics and take advantage of changing policies. There's also retail choice for consumers, so commercial buyers can enter into contracts freely. And the last thing is that the spot market price of electricity is publicly available, and it actually reflects the real cost of electricity generation. So having that transparency of price also allows for companies to enter into contracts understanding what the cost of electricity is going to be like. So not everyone needs to completely deregulate their market like Alberta does, but I think these are 3 key elements that you need to make corporate procurement happen rapidly. I do want to point out here, though, that Alberta has had a deregulated market since 2001. But this uptake in renewables didn't happen until 2017, which is when the low price of renewables were met with a renewable energy target and a well-designed procurement program. So market design and policy mandates need to go hand in hand. And what I'd reiterate is that innovation cannot happen in a policy vacuum. So I want to thank everyone in the room here who's been doing the tireless work of pursuing policy change and market reform. You don't get great photo ops, but I think it's really critical work. Thanks, Jan.
Thanks a lot. A great point. I mean, yeah, market design, once you mention that, a lot of people fall asleep because they think it's boring, but it's so critical and it really makes a big difference. My next question is for Mark from Carbon Tracker. Mark, you've worked for many years on trying to understand the risk of stranded assets. You know, we're still investing heavily, even now, in new fossil fuel generation. I just read yesterday, and I tweeted about it, that for the first time last year, we've actually lent more money for green energy projects than for fossil generation. But it's still almost 50-50. And by 2030, that ratio needs to be 4-to-1 in favor of green. How do we get there? How can we make sure we avoid ending up in a situation with lots of stranded assets?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So if we can go briefly back to the idea of the carbon budget, we currently emit about 50 gigatons of CO2 a year, and we have about 300 gigatons of carbon budget left before we go through 1.5 degrees. So the maths is really straightforward. We go through 1.5 in less than a decade if emissions don't bend down very, very rapidly. So we have to cut emissions by 50% within a decade to have any chance of achieving 1.5. So against that, we have this strange situation where institutional investors, large banks are planning to increase the amount of capital going to not just oil and gas, but coal. So last year during the COP, there was a listing of a coal company on the London Stock Exchange. Today, there is a listing on the London Stock Exchange of one of the largest oil and gas companies raising new money, including the famous Cambo project. So there's a mismatch between what the science tells us to do and what the capital markets are actually doing around fossil fuels. Carbon Tracker's analysis is there's around 1,000 gigatons of CO2 in reserves of companies listed on the world stock markets, whether it's New York or London or Joburg. So 3 times more than the remaining carbon budget. So we have a bit of a problem. So that's sort of the bad news. The good news is that we're currently building out renewables at a very, very rapid scale. So we've got around 2 terawatt hours of installed capacity of wind and solar globally on the ground, which is growing around 20% a year. Set to reach about 40% of global generation by 2030. So just looking at that figure alone, there's a lot of coal and oil and gas that's going to be retired or unneeded. So investors have got this stranded asset problem. And if growth continues like that for another 6 years, wind and solar capacity will reach around 8 terawatt hours. That's around 8,000 gigawatts, which in 20 years is more than all the global fossil fuel capacity amassed over the last century, which is around 7.6 terawatts. So that's the good news. We're building it out rapidly, but is it going to be fast enough? And that really comes the challenge. And everything that I heard from the previous panel gives me the excitement that we've got the technology, we've got the cost downs in renewable energy generation. We heard about the price competitiveness of renewables versus coal in Japan. I mean, that's terrific news. Now we just have to deploy the capital at scale to scale up the renewables. And if we we had gas at 330 pounds a megawatt hour in the United Kingdom over the summer versus wind, which was coming in at 48 pounds a megawatt hour. So renewables were 6 times cheaper than gas. What beggars belief to me is you've still got countries planning to build out gas and gas-fired power, which will take them 4 or 5 years to create those facilities when you can get your solar and your wind up a lot faster and a lot cheaper. So we need investors and regulators and policymakers to actually see what the technologies are succeeding at and act accordingly.
Thank you. I would like to ask Ben a question next about wind. You know, when I did my undergraduate degree 20 years ago, I was told by two German power system engineers the grid could never ever cope with more than 5% renewables. The last time I checked, I think Germany had more than 50%. I think it was 53% in the last half year of electricity was from renewables, mainly wind. So the question that I have for you, Ben, is you know, what do you say to people who don't believe that wind can provide reliable electricity generation? You know, who will say, oh, the wind doesn't blow always, does it? So we can't have much of it. What's your response to skeptics that think wind isn't a reliable resource?
Thank you, Jan, and thank you for this invitation to all the organisers of Pembina Institute and our other partners here. So what do I say to people when they are still sceptical? I mean, first of all, I point to examples. You know, you've used the example of Germany, Jan. In the UK, we heard from David Wright earlier. I mean, we're an island in the UK, and we have days where we have 60% of wind on the system, offshore wind on the system. And we've been in GWEC through this many, many times, and you know, we get to a situation where we get to 5-10%, and then you get some, you know, kind of worry amongst grid operators. That envelope is kind of being stretched now. Generally 20-25%, we get some pushback, but then we can show with interconnection and the combination of different technologies that actually you can go far further than that, and you've seen that in Denmark, you've seen that in the UK, and as countries are more interconnected and regions are more interconnected and technologies coexist, you know, it's a problem that we can quite clearly show that we can solve. However, that doesn't always solve the problem, and we still see, for instance, in Southeast Asia, quite big pushback from governments and grid operators who are still worried about the impact that coal phase out and the deployment of renewables is going to have. We still see in Africa, in places where there's a very, very small amount of renewable energy on the grid, pushback from ministers and others. I think some of it is just purely us not telling our story effectively. Some of it's us not sharing the information in the right way. And it's great now to be working with people like yourselves and Power in POSCO and other initiatives, I think, are telling that story very, very well. And I think some of it is political pushback from incumbents, and I think that hasn't gone away either. I mean, I'd like to make a couple of points around what Mark said. I mean, clearly somebody here doesn't believe what we're saying, because otherwise we wouldn't still be investing in fossil, as Mark said. And I was at a conference in London recently organised by the Financial Times, and it was really quite remarkable how people were talking about investing into gas mainly up into the 2040s and 50s. There was significant pushback from some of the fossil fuel companies there. I mean, pretty much people behaving as if the transition is not happening. And I want to sound the word of caution here. I mean, we're at COP, and in a way we're kind of in a friendly community of people who are talking about the transition, or others, you know, pretending to genuinely talk about the transition. But I personally have seen a lot more pushback this year than I've seen in quite a long time. And I think the real question here, I mean, 3 days before the conference, The Economist decided to come out and tell us that 1.5 degrees was dead in a very kind of helpful way. I mean, I don't know why they decided just the week before COP. If you actually read the article, there was no new data particularly. But I think that's a factor of the fact that we are actually running very, very far behind on renewables deployment. In that sense, I differ a little bit from Mark. I mean, I'm a little bit more glass half empty than you are, Mark. Purely because I see it from the wind point of view. I also look at the solar figures. We're installing roughly about 100 gigawatts a year in wind. Now, to get to the 8 terawatts or 8.3 terawatts the IEA says by 2050, which would make us the biggest single source of electricity, we'd probably need to be installing about 4 times that at the moment. In fact, the IEA has this figure of 390 gigawatts to get to their net zero scenario by the end of the decade. And we're quite a long way away from that. Like I said, we should have hit 100 this year. In fact, I think we're not going to hit it. We're going to be slightly below that. In fact, we're going to have a pretty similar year to 2021. And simply, the question for me is that everything takes too long. Even in the best planning systems and the ones that are held up as a success, like the UK, it takes 8 or 9 years to do an offshore wind farm. It's worse in many other places. There's onshore wind farms that are stuck in a development pipeline, some of them for decades in some countries. And simply everything is delayed or held up in bureaucracy. I personally don't think with business as usual, as it is at the moment, we're going to get to where we should do in terms of our targets. And I think the other thing I'd like to mention in terms of market design, yes, we've done a lot of good stuff, but it's too complex in many ways. You know, we're in a climate emergency here, and for me, we need simple offtake schemes where everyone can come forward with their projects. Auctioning, in many cases, has become a kind of tap that governments can kind of switch on and switch off, depending on how they're feeling, depending on whether there's a change of government, depending on what they think their GDP growth is going. So auctioning, while it's been really good to have price discovery and to be able to illustrate that we're cheaper than fossil fuels, it's also created a mechanism where development and progress it can just be kind of turned up or down depending on how governments are feeling. So I'm actually a bit more critical than most of the other people on this panel. We're definitely not on track for our sector. I don't think the other sectors are either. And something really needs to be done to cut through the confusion and the bureaucracy if we're going to get there. There's a lot of targets, and what I see is a kind of target inflation. And it's countries that don't meet their ambitions on the ground, and there's many countries among them. And what they do is they just simply create a bigger target for 2040 or 2050. But if you look at the actual trajectory, we're not on it. So, really a word of kind of urging everyone in this room to kind of work towards simplification and how do we cut through and ensure that we're putting on the amounts of renewable power that we're going to need. Thank you.
Thank you. Binnu made an important point before about market reform and the importance of markets. My next question is for Joojin from SFOC. And that is, we've seen other countries, industrialized countries in Europe in particular, and I think it was on Mika's slide, the map where you could see I think it was generation of capacity, what's the biggest source. And I think Japan comes out with coal, I think it was. And other countries, like Korea, but also Mexico, Indonesia, South Africa have similar issues. Is there commonality that you can see from where you sit, where you think there's something hampering progress? Why is there a gap between some of the front runners and countries like the ones I've just mentioned?
Thank you. Well, before going to your question, thank you very much for your last point on the bureaucracy of the permitting of renewable projects. I think it's a very technical and detailed issue, but I think getting into the details of that represents climate leadership. And I think those kind of discussions, 9 years taking to build a renewable power plant, an offshore wind power plant, should be a topic of discussion, should be one of the initiatives that the COPs have to discuss about. And unfortunately, because it's so technical, because it's so specific, sometimes people forget about it. But I think leadership comes from the details. The devils are in the details. And the market reform piece we're talking about today also is one of the details. It should no longer be a sovereign issue. It should no longer be a technical issue that discussions here should not cover. It's one of the key issues that we are realizing after the coal phase-out announcement that took place last year in Glasgow. Going back to your question, yes, the question is that the countries that you mentioned, South Africa and Mexico, Japan, Korea, all have pretty similar problems. Basically, the generation assets and the network assets, the distribution and transmission assets are connected. So, for example, if Samsung Electronics says that we're going to go renewable energy 100% in Korea, that means that our national utility may have to get rid of one of their legacy assets, one of their coal or nuclear assets, and it's a big challenge. And if the same company controlling the grid and the pricing and the access to the grid also has legacy assets. The result is pretty much, the same. So I think this issue has to be, whether we have been providing fair access, a fair market for renewables, should be a topic that has to be discussed at COPs. I think, for example, for that reason, this is not just something that the experts here should be. Maybe antitrust, competition law expert should start looking at this issue and coming to COPs and see that this is the climate crisis is something, they have a role in the climate crisis. However, I think there is also good news here because the fact that we had a steel company here in today's panel, which was something that we couldn't expect in the past, is good news. Mr. Park may have not been clear, but we understand that for POSCO, for companies like POSCO, procuring renewable energy is a big problem. We also had a side event last week talking about fair markets for renewables. We had a Samsung vice president sitting from the beginning to the end of the side event, listening to the session. That kind of represents change, even in Asia. And I think we should take opportunity of that change, kind of deliver. I mean, we are very national. I mean, we are very state-led economies where exporting products of Samsung or POSCO is important. Organizing that voice, consolidating that voice is going to be really, really important. I also think what Mika mentioned about the prices of oil and LNG and renewables is also a very important point because the unfortunate invasion of Ukraine by Russia has kind of made very clear that renewables is the answer. And the same thing, I mean, just as much as Europe is experiencing difficulties with the Ukraine invasion, we too are experiencing the same thing because LNG and coal has gone so much up. Our national utility is in severe financial debt, and as a result of that, and with its strong sovereign bond ratings, it has been vacuuming capital market money, and that has creating a credit crunch in other sides of the economy. So what Europe is experiencing, we're experiencing the same form. I think these should be considered in the discussion. As I mentioned, the details of market reform, the details, I mean, that Special Envoy Murton has been experiencing during the Just Energy Transition Package discussions should become a very important part of these discussions, the COP discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have 1 minute left, I think, until the closing remarks. Maybe we could take one very short question. I'm looking at the MC. Yes? No? Yes? One quick question, if there is one. I can't. Yeah, there is one. I don't know whether we have a mic. No, or you could just. We can repeat it.
Hi, thanks so much. My name is Francesca Butler. I am a student researcher from the University of Illinois in the United States. And in particular at this COP, I'm looking at how carbon capture usage and sequestration is being used to kind of address climate change and the way in which we're interacting with our world. So the question I would like to pose to the panel is how are we introducing and talking about carbon capture and carbon offsets whenever we're transitioning into wind and solar?
Mark, do you want to take
Look,
that?
with wind and solar already being cheaper than fossil fuels, once you've added in the cost of carbon capture and storage, you're making uneconomic projects even more uneconomic. And I think what you're seeing that CCS is, and you're hearing a lot of it here, is being held out as a justification for continuing business as usual. My view on this is that the internal combustion engine, power generation from coal and gas, we've reached an end, and that there's what we're going to need CCS for, negative emissions technology, is if we go overshoot in 1.5. When we talk about net zero, net zero means removing all the CO2 from the atmosphere from the last 70 years. So we're about 418 parts per million. We've got to go back to 350. And that's where we're going to need any negative emissions technologies. CCS, I see it's very marginal. I was in a room where I heard industry pleading with governments to subsidize them to do CCS. Let the markets tell investors and society what's happening. The market's telling us that renewables are winning. CCS is a last gasp. It's not being done at scale. We hear everyone talking about it, but none of it is being done in reality. None of it is scale is being done in reality. We're going to need 300 carbon capture and storage plants a year, every year for 15 years, and even then it only just barely takes into account what all the emissions from the past, and it certainly won't allow emissions to continue from the future. Sorry to be so negative about it. It's just I've heard so much CCS in the last three or 4 days. It's totally unrealistic, and it's driving me up the wall. If CCS is the answer, then I'm a banana.
That's the end of the panel discussion. I hope that we can close on some optimistic remarks from Mary that are about opportunities and the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to the panelists. I just really like to begin by thanking the organizers of this event, Solutions for Our Climate, for the invitation to the IEA to join you. I'm really delighted to be here, and I can see it's been a very interesting discussion, and really appreciate all the perspectives I've just heard. This conversation on approaches for a clean, secure, and just energy transition could not be more timely. Indeed, as the IEA has highlighted, the world is facing the first global energy crisis, and signs of tension in global markets were evident even before Russia invaded Ukraine. But the Russian invasion tipped the energy sector into a full-blown crisis. This crisis is affecting every fuel from oil to gas to coal to electricity, and it's hitting the most vulnerable countries and communities hardest, those who already struggle to access and pay for modern energy sources. At the IEA, we estimate that 100 million people will no longer be able to afford to cook with modern and clean fuels, and 70 million people will no longer be able to pay for access to electricity. But we are also confident that this crisis will come to be seen as a turning point in the energy transition. Governments around the world are stepping up with new policies and real money to give the energy transition a significant boost. And the main motivation for this is that today's crisis shows that mitigating climate change and ensuring security and affordability can go hand in hand. As a consequence of these policies, we've seen real change coming to the energy sector. In our 2020 World Economic Outlook, for example, we project that clean energy investment globally will double from today's levels to reach $2 trillion by 2030. Indeed, we already saw clean energy investment in 2021 surpassing the highest ever historical level of investment in fossil fuel supply, which was in 2014. In addition, we project for the first time under current policy settings a clear peak in demand in each of the fossil fuels in the coming decade or decade and a half. And to 2030, we project that all of global electricity demand growth will be met from low emissions sources, allowing electricity sector emissions to peak this decade under current policy settings. This is clearly not enough to achieve our climate goals, but it is encouraging nonetheless. Our World Energy Outlook dedicated an entire chapter to setting out how we can accelerate the energy transition while at the same time ensuring secure and affordable energy for all. We call this the 10 Essentials for Secure Energy Transitions. And I'd like to share just a few of the highlights with you. First, energy transitions must be met by dramatic increases in clean energy investment. I think we just heard that from the panelists, and there's no doubt that's the case. Recent investment levels in clean energy technologies have been far below what is needed to bring about a peak and decline in fossil fuel demand, yet investment in fossil fuel supply has been geared towards a world of stagnant or even declining demand for these fuels, and this is unsustainable. So to resolve this situation, we very much need a big push on clean energy investment. Second, help emerging market and developing economies into the new energy economy. Today, we're facing a very uneven energy transition. Clean energy investment in emerging market and developing economies outside of China has been essentially stagnant since the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015. And developing economies face numerous barriers to clean energy investment, not least a higher cost of capital. Our cost of capital observatory shows that the cost of capital in emerging market and developing economies is almost 3 to 4 times higher than advanced economies, and these challenges need to be addressed. Third, manage the retirement and the reuse of existing infrastructure carefully, as some of it will be essential for transitions. Shutting down fossil fuel infrastructure as quickly as possible is often assumed to be the primary task of clean energy transitions. But I'd like to make a couple of points in this connection. Firstly, fossil fuel demand does not fall to zero, even in our net zero emissions by 2050 scenario. Secondly, some existing infrastructure can be reused and repurposed to support the clean energy economy. For the duration of transitions, we will need to pay attention to the coexistence and interaction of both the fossil fuel and clean energy systems. So to conclude, let me leave you with the important message that the IEA has been stressing for some time now. We must avoid new divisions on energy and climate. Developed and developing countries, energy producers, and energy consumers need to work together to provide the foundation for secure, affordable, and sustainable energy for all. And that starts by setting clear goals and policies for the energy sector in order to drive the needed investments. We hope that our World Energy Outlook and similar publications can help to provide this kind of a strategic vision. But once the direction is set, partnerships to get there are also critical to share and step up technology, finance, and know-how, and work closely with developing countries in the transition. So thanks very much for the opportunity to say a few words. It's really been a pleasure to be a part of this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for your closing remark, Ms. Mary Buzz Warlick. And let me close the event. Thank you for coming here, joining us, and special thanks to all our speakers and the co-hosts of the event. Thank you so much.